The polished marble floor reflected my son-in-law's smirk as he said, "I was too old to understand money." As I folded my hands and said nothing, I let him believe the room belonged to him. While the soft hum of the bank echoed around us, I felt decades of deals and discipline settle back into place. The same quiet hum followed me when the manager walked past him and called my name instead. That's when I realized respect doesn't vanish with age. It waits for the right moment to return. Still standing there, I decided I wouldn't argue for relevance. I demonstrated. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The glass doors of the bank slid open with a soft mechanical sigh, and Tom Harris stepped inside, adjusting the collar of his jacket out of habit more than necessity. The lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and coffee, clean, expensive, efficient. He'd been in places like this his entire adult life. Boardrooms, private offices, quiet corners where decisions worth millions were made with a nod instead of a handshake. Today shouldn't have felt any different. Samantha walked beside him, clutching a leather folder to her chest. She looked nervous, eyes flicking toward the counters and then back to her phone, as if checking the time might somehow steady her. Tom noticed it, said nothing. He knew this meeting mattered to her. It was about consolidating family accounts, restructuring a few investments, nothing dramatic, nothing he hadn't done 100 times before. Still, he could feel the tension humming beneath the surface. Ethan trailed half a step behind them, already scanning the room with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged everywhere he stood. He let out a quiet chuckle as Tom approached the reception desk. "Dad, sorry, Tom." Ethan corrected himself with a thin smile. "I've got this. These things move faster if you know how the system works now." Tom turned slightly, meeting his son-in-law's eyes. "I was just going to ask for Clara Williams. She's expecting—" Ethan waved him off, not even subtle about it. "That's exactly what I mean. Bank managers don't really handle this stuff anymore. It's all portfolio teams and digital approvals. Different world." Samantha shifted uncomfortably. "Ethan," but he was already warming to his point, voice low but sharp. "No offense, Tom, but you're too old to understand money the way it works today." The words landed harder than Tom expected. Not because they were loud, Ethan had said them casually, almost lazily, but because of how easily they came. Like a truth he'd been carrying for years, just waiting for the right moment to say out loud. For a split second, Tom felt something tighten in his chest. A flash of boardrooms, of late nights, of risks taken, and companies built from nothing. Of names signed on documents that had shaped careers, including, indirectly, Ethan's. His jaw set, but he didn't raise his voice. He glanced at Samantha instead, saw the color rise in her cheeks, the conflict written plainly on her face. "It's fine," Tom said evenly. "We're here together, that's all." Ethan smirked, satisfied, and stepped forward to speak with the receptionist, launching into an explanation that sounded rehearsed, polished, and incomplete. Tom listened quietly, hands folded, reminding himself that this wasn't the place. Not yet. Then it happened. A woman emerged from a glass-walled office near the back of the lobby. Mid-40s, composed, sharp eyes that missed very little. She paused when she saw them, her gaze settling not on Ethan, but on Tom. Her expression shifted just slightly, but Tom caught it. Recognition, clear and unmistakable. "Mr. Harris?" she said, already walking toward them. Ethan straightened, turning with a practiced smile. "Yes, hi. I'm Ethan Clark. We're here for a—" Clara Williams didn't even break stride. "Tom Harris," she repeated, offering her hand directly to him. "It's been a long time." Tom blinked once, then took her hand. "Miss Williams, Clara, please call me Tom." Her smile was professional, but there was something else beneath it. Respect. Familiarity. "I was just reviewing some legacy accounts tied to your name last month. I didn't realize you'd be coming in today." Ethan's smile faltered. Samantha looked from Clara to her father, surprised. Clara glanced briefly at Ethan, then back to Tom. "Why don't we step into my office? We'll need a few minutes of privacy." Ethan cleared his throat. "I should probably be part of that. I'm handling the financial strategy for the family now." Clara paused. The air seemed to shift. "Of course," she said politely. Then, with a calm that carried authority, she added, "But for this part, I'll need Mr. Harris alone." If you don't mind stepping aside for a moment." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Tom didn't look at Ethan right away. He felt Samantha's eyes on him, felt Ethan's disbelief radiating beside him. As he followed Clara toward her office, he allowed himself one quiet realization to settle in. For the first time in a long while, someone in the room knew exactly who he was, and Ethan had no idea what that meant yet. Clara's office was quiet in a way that felt intentional, insulated from the muted hum of the lobby outside. She gestured for Tom to take a seat across from her desk, leather chair worn just enough to suggest it had hosted serious conversations. Through the glass wall, Tom could see Ethan pacing near the reception area, phone in hand, jaw tight. Samantha hovered nearby, unsure whether to sit or stand, caught between worlds. "Please," Clara said gently, closing the door behind them. "Let's give ourselves a moment." Tom sat, hands resting on his knees, posture straight out of habit. "I appreciate the privacy," he said, then paused. "But I'll be honest, I'm a little confused. You asked Ethan to step aside. He's not used to that." Clara studied him for a beat, as if deciding how much to say. "I imagine not," she replied. Her tone was calm, measured. "But my role is to understand who I'm dealing with. And with respect, Mr. Harris, I know exactly who you are." Tom let out a quiet breath. "Then you know I'm not running things the way I used to." "That may be," Clara said, "but it doesn't erase what you built." She leaned forward slightly. "I've read your file. Not just the numbers, the history. Harris Industrial's early expansions, the Westlake merger, the way you structured debt before leveraged buyouts became fashionable." Tom blinked, genuinely surprised. Those names belonged to another chapter of his life, one he'd learned not to bring up. "Most people don't remember those deals." "They don't," Clara agreed. "But the systems they rely on every day were shaped by them. You were doing in-person risk modeling before algorithms were trusted to do it. You stabilized companies, others were ready to strip for parts." Something warm and unfamiliar settled in Tom's chest. Not pride, exactly more like recognition long deferred. That was a long time ago. "Experience doesn't expire," Clara said quietly. "It compounds." Outside, Ethan stopped pacing and glanced toward the office. Through the glass, he could see them talking, really talking. His foot tapped against the floor, impatience bleeding into irritation. He checked his watch, then his phone again, as if waiting for the moment he could reclaim control. Tom followed Clara's gaze briefly, then looked back at her. "You could have let him run the meeting." "I could have," she said. "But that wouldn't have been responsible. Mr. Clark understands momentum. He understands presentation. But depth?" She chose her words carefully. "Depth comes from having survived mistakes, from knowing what breaks when the market turns." Tom absorbed that in silence. Years ago, he would have nodded and moved on. Today, it felt different. It felt earned. Clara opened a folder on her desk, sliding a document toward him. "Do you remember the restructuring of Atlas Freight in 2002? A corner of Tom's mouth lifted. "Barely anyone thought it would work. You insisted on preserving the pension obligations," Clara said, "against every recommendation." "They'd built that company," Tom replied. "Walking away would have gutted the workforce." "That decision," Clara said, tapping the paper, "is cited in case studies now. Ethical restructuring, sustainable recovery. People don't say your name anymore, but they follow your blueprint." Tom leaned back slightly, the weight of years shifting inside him. For so long, he'd let the silence around his past become proof that it no longer mattered. Sitting there, hearing it spoken aloud, he realized how wrong that assumption had been. In the lobby, Ethan's discomfort had sharpened into something closer to dread. He watched Clara nod as Tom spoke now, watched her listen. This wasn't the dynamic he expected. He'd brought Tom along as a formality, a courtesy, nothing more. Inside the office, Tom straightened, his voice steady. "If I've learned anything," he said, "it's that money doesn't change. People do. Fear does. Greed does. The rest is just tools." Clara smiled. "Exactly." As she began outlining current market shifts, how old frameworks were being rediscovered under new names, Tom felt something click into place. Not anger, not vengeance, purpose. He thought of family meetings where he'd stayed quiet, of decisions made without him, of assumptions Ethan had carried unchallenged. Through the glass, Ethan caught Tom's eye for the first time since they'd separated. Tom didn't look away. He didn't smile either, and as Clara continued speaking, Tom began, quietly and carefully, to plan his next move. The drive home from the bank was quiet in the way only unresolved tension could make it. Tom sat in the passenger seat, watching familiar streets pass by as if they belonged to another city, another life. Glass towers rose where brick buildings used to stand. Old firms had new names now, their logos sleeker, their language faster. Efficiency had replaced patience. Visibility had replaced substance. Somewhere along the way, experience had become something to apologize for instead of rely on. He remembered a time when rooms went silent when he spoke, when executives leaned forward, pens hovering, waiting to see which direction he would point the conversation. Back then, respect wasn't demanded. It was assumed. You earned it once, and it followed you for decades. Or at least, he'd believed it did. Ethan's voice replayed in his head, casual and cutting, too old to understand money. It wasn't the first time, just the first time it had been said so plainly. There had been dinners where Ethan corrected him mid-sentence, meetings where his suggestions were brushed aside with a smile, decisions made after Tom had left the room. Small moments, easy to ignore individually, years of them, harder to dismiss. And somehow, Samantha had always been there, sitting between them, trying to smooth the edges without choosing a side. Now, in the driver's seat, Samantha's hands tightened around the steering wheel. She'd noticed it this time. Tom could tell. Her glances came more often, lingering in the mirror, searching his face for something, anger, maybe, or disappointment. "Dad," she said, finally hesitant. Ethan didn't mean it the way it sounded. Tom kept his eyes forward. He meant it exactly the way it sounded. She swallowed. "He's under a lot of pressure. The business, the expectations." "So am I," Tom replied, not unkindly. "I just don't announce it." The silence returned, heavier now. Samantha nodded, but the uncertainty in her expression didn't fade. She was trying to hold two truths at once, the man who raised her, and the man she'd chosen. And Tom understood, perhaps better than Ethan ever could, how impossible that position was. Later that evening, alone in his study, Tom replayed the conversation with Clara. The way she spoke about his past, not as nostalgia, but as foundation. She hadn't dismissed modern tools or trends. She'd contextualized them, framed them as extensions of principles he'd lived by long before they had names. Markets still ran on fear and confidence, on trust and timing. The instruments had changed. The instincts hadn't. Clara's words echoed, "Experience doesn't expire, it compounds." For the first time in years, Tom didn't feel like he was defending a fading legacy. He felt like he was standing on something solid again, and that clarity sharpened his resolve. This wasn't about proving Ethan wrong out of spite. It was about refusing to disappear quietly from his own family's future. The next afternoon, Tom met Clara again briefly, this time under the pretense of reviewing account structures. She spoke openly about new financial trends, algorithmic trading, compressed decision cycles, investor impatience. But each explanation circled back to fundamentals he knew well: risk management, long-term positioning, the danger of overconfidence. "You've always been conservative where it counts," she said. "That's not outdated. That's rare." Tom smiled, a small acknowledgement. Ethan mistakes speed for control. Clara didn't argue. She didn't need to. As Tom walked out of the bank alone, he realized something else, something uncomfortable but necessary. Ethan's arrogance wasn't really about him. It was about fear. Fear of being exposed. Fear that the success he projected might not hold up under scrutiny. Tom had seen it before in younger men, in overconfident executives, in himself once, long ago. Understanding that didn't soften the insult, but it gave Tom leverage. At home that night, Samantha lingered in the doorway of his study. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I am," Tom said. And for once, it was true. After she left, he opened an old leather notebook he hadn't touched in years. Inside were names, numbers, notes from deals long closed but not forgotten. He didn't call anyone. Not yet. He simply reviewed, considered, connected dots. There was no announcement to make, no confrontation to stage, Not yet. But as Tom closed the notebook and set it carefully on his desk, one decision settled firmly in his mind. He was done being passive. And soon enough, Ethan was going to feel that shift whether he was ready for it or not. Tom chose a quiet cafe a few blocks from Samantha's office, the kind of place where conversations blended into background noise, and no one paid much attention to who was sitting where. Samantha arrived a few minutes late, eyes tired, phone still in her hand as if she'd just stepped out of another argument. She slid into the chair across from him, offering a small, apologetic smile. "I've been thinking about the bank," she said before the server even walked away. About what Ethan said. Tom nodded but didn't interrupt. He'd learned patience the hard way. "He didn't mean to hurt you," Samantha continued. "He gets blunt when he's stressed, especially about work." Tom looked at her steadily. "Blunt is telling someone you disagree with them. What he did was dismiss me." She exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "You know he respects you." Tom almost smiled at that. Almost. "Does he? Because respect doesn't sound like being talked over, or corrected in front of you, or being treated like a liability every time money comes up." Samantha looked down, struggling for words. "He's trying to prove himself." "So was I," Tom said quietly. "Once. The difference is, I didn't do it by cutting others down." The silence between them stretched. Samantha shifted in her seat, clearly torn. "I feel like I'm always choosing sides," she admitted. "If I push back on Ethan, he says I don't support him. If I defend him, you feel hurt. I don't know how to fix that." Tom's expression softened, but his voice didn't. "I'm not asking you to choose. I'm asking you to notice." She frowned. "Notice what?" "That this didn't start at the bank," Tom said. "It's been happening for years. And every time it does, you smooth it over. You tell me he didn't mean it, that I should let it go." Her shoulders slumped slightly. "I thought that was helping." "It helped him," Tom replied. "It taught him there were no consequences." Samantha's eyes glistened, frustration mixing with guilt. "I didn't realize it went that deep." Tom leaned back, studying her face. "That's the problem. You didn't have to. I carried it so you wouldn't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, cars passed. People laughed. Life moved on, untouched by the fracture forming at their table. "I'm not trying to take anything away from Ethan," Tom said finally, "but I won't keep shrinking to make him comfortable." Samantha nodded slowly, though uncertainty still lingered. "What are you going to do?" Tom didn't answer directly. "I'm going to remind him who he's dealing with." Quietly. At the same time, across town, Ethan sat in a sleek conference room with David Martin, venting with barely contained irritation. "Did you see the way Clara treated him?" Ethan snapped. "Like I wasn't even there." David listened, hands folded, expression unreadable. "She's known Tom a long time." "That shouldn't matter," Ethan insisted. "This is my project, my strategy, and suddenly, I'm being sidelined." David raised an eyebrow. "Or maybe you underestimated him," Ethan scoffed. "Come on, he's outdated." "Outdated doesn't usually make bank managers nervous," David replied calmly. Ethan fell silent, jaw tightening. David wasn't taking his side. That alone felt like a warning. Back at the cafe, Tom stood, slipping on his jacket. "I love you," he said to Samantha, "but I won't keep asking for space I've already earned." She looked up at him, something close to fear in her eyes. "I don't want this to tear us apart." "It won't," Tom said, "unless it's ignored." He walked away before she could respond, the decision settling deeper with each step. If Ethan believed experience was obsolete, Tom would let him believe it right up until the moment it proved decisive. And somewhere between pride and patience, Tom prepared to make his first move. Tom didn't act immediately. That was the first thing that surprised even him. The frustration was there, tight, restless, but it no longer pushed him toward impulsive words or defensive explanations. Instead, it sharpened his focus. One evening, after the house had gone quiet, he sat alone in his study and pulled out the old contact book he'd kept updated, more out of habit than intention. Names he hadn't dialed in years stared back at him, reminders of relationships that had never truly gone away. He made the first call just after 9, then another, then another. The conversations were brief at first, cautious, like hands reaching across a table to test whether the other side was still willing to meet. But the tone shifted quickly. Familiar voices warmed. Old jokes resurfaced. Respect, buried but intact, rose to the surface. "Tom Harris," one man said with a laugh. "I was starting to think you'd retired for real." Tom smiled to himself. "I slowed down," he replied. "I didn't disappear." By the third call, he realized something important. He wasn't asking for favors. He was reopening doors he'd built himself. These people hadn't forgotten him. They'd simply assumed he'd chosen to step out of the game. 2 days later, his phone rang while he was reviewing notes at his desk. The name on the screen made him pause before answering. "Richard," Tom said. "Didn't expect to hear from you this soon." Richard Cole's voice crackled through the line. Older now, but unmistakably energized. "I wouldn't have called if it wasn't worth your time. There's a restructuring opportunity coming up, mid-market logistics firm, undervalued, badly managed. The kind of mess you always knew how to untangle." Tom leaned back in his chair. "Why me?" "Because the board trusts you," Richard said plainly. "And because if this goes right, it doesn't just make money, it reshapes control." The words settled heavily. Control. Not a short-term win, but leverage. Something that could alter the family's financial trajectory in ways Ethan hadn't anticipated. "Send me the details," Tom said after a moment. Quietly. While Tom absorbed the implications, Ethan was busy accelerating. He moved aggressively, pitching bold expansions, pushing timelines tighter, dismissing concerns from advisors who urged caution. Confidence filled the gaps where scrutiny should have lived. To him, momentum felt like proof, but cracks were forming. A deal stalled when projected numbers didn't survive a second review. An investor hesitated, asking questions Ethan hadn't prepared for. Small things, easy to explain away, but they accumulated. And each time Ethan doubled down, his tone sharpened, his patience thinned. At home, Samantha noticed the strain. Ethan spoke faster, slept less. He dismissed her questions with irritation, insisting everything was under control. Tom said nothing, observing from a distance, taking careful note of where ambition was beginning to outrun judgment. By the end of the week, Tom had made a decision. The upcoming family business meeting, something he'd skipped more often than not, would be different. He wouldn't attend as a courtesy. He would attend with purpose. Not to argue, not to embarrass, but to establish something Ethan couldn't talk over. Presence. The morning after he marked the date on his calendar, another unexpected call came through. This one stopped him cold. "Tom," Clara Williams said, her voice low and deliberate. "I hope I'm not overstepping." "You're not," Tom replied. "What's on your mind?" She didn't waste time. "I've been reviewing recent movements tied to Ethan's ventures. A lot of surface confidence, not much depth." Tom closed his eyes briefly. "That aligns with what I'm seeing." "There are people who still listen to you," Clara continued. "Boards, lenders, quiet stakeholders who don't like volatility dressed up as innovation." "And you?" Tom asked. She paused. "I'd like to help ensure the family's future is built on substance, not optics. If that means reinforcing your role, I'm willing." The offer was measured, professional but unmistakable. Support from inside the system Ethan believed he controlled. After the call ended, Tom sat alone, the weight of it all settling into clarity. He now had information, allies, and an opportunity that could shift everything if handled correctly. What he didn't yet know was how Ethan would react when he realized the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as he believed. And that reckoning was closer than anyone in the family expected. Tom treated preparation the way he always had, not as rehearsal, but as alignment. The morning of the meeting, he woke early, reviewed notes he'd written by hand, and chose his words carefully in his head. He wasn't going in to argue. He wasn't going in to defend himself. He was going in to steer the conversation, the way he used to, by asking the right questions and letting others realize on their own who actually understood the terrain. 2 days before, he'd arranged a lunch downtown, quiet and deliberate. No emails, no assistants, just a few calls that carried history behind them. The restaurant was old school, tucked between glass towers that hadn't existed when Tom last made deals in that part of the city. When he arrived, the maitre d' greeted him by name. That alone told him something hadn't changed. One by one, his former colleagues arrived. Men and women who had aged, like him, into something sharper rather than slower. They greeted Tom with firm handshakes, warm smiles, the kind reserved for someone who'd once gone to bat for them when it mattered. "You don't call unless it's important," one of them said as they sat. Tom nodded. "I wouldn't waste your time." They talked over lunch, not about the past, but about the present. Market volatility, over-leveraged expansions, young executives mistaking confidence for certainty. Tom didn't lecture. He listened. When he spoke, it was concise, grounded, unsettling in its accuracy. By the time coffee arrived, the respect in the room was no longer nostalgic. It was current. "You'll be at the meeting?" another asked. "I will," Tom replied. "Good," she said simply. "Then so will I." Meanwhile, Ethan felt it before he understood it. Calls went unanswered. Responses came slower. When he pitched ideas, the enthusiasm he'd grown used to felt muted. At the office, he caught fragments of conversations that stopped when he entered the room. No one challenged him outright, but no one reassured him either. He told himself it was nothing, just nerves, just coincidence. At home, Samantha noticed the change in him. He was more defensive, quicker to dismiss questions. Still, she found herself defending him to friends, to her mother, even to herself. Yet doubt crept in quietly. She replayed moments from meetings she'd attended. Times Ethan had brushed off concerns instead of addressing them. Times Tom would have slowed things down, asked what no one else wanted to ask. She didn't know what Tom was planning. She only knew something was shifting. The day of the meeting arrived, and the room filled faster than expected. When Tom walked in, conversations paused, not dramatically, but noticeably. He took his seat without ceremony, nodding to faces that registered relief rather than surprise. Ethan arrived moments later and stopped short. He hadn't expected this. Several of the people seated around the table weren't just observers. They were decision-makers, people whose approval he'd been courting for months. And they were greeting Tom first. The meeting began. Ethan launched into his presentation with practiced ease. Numbers clean, projections aggressive. Tom listened without interrupting, fingers steepled, expression neutral. When Ethan finished, the silence lingered just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Then Tom spoke. "Before we talk growth," he said calmly, "I'd like to understand the downside exposure." Ethan answered quickly, a little too quickly. Tom followed with another question, then another. Each one precise, each one stripping away assumptions Ethan hadn't realized he'd been leaning on. No accusations, no raised voices, just clarity. Heads around the table began to turn not toward Ethan, but toward Tom. Pens moved. Notes were taken. Ethan felt heat rise in his chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't his stage anymore. As the discussion shifted, Tom didn't take control outright. He didn't need to. The room gave it to him, piece by piece. And as Ethan sat there, watching years of assumptions unravel in real time, one truth settled in with chilling certainty. He had misjudged Tom completely. And now, there was no easy way to take that power back. The meeting didn't explode. It tightened. What began as a routine review slowly transformed into something sharper, more deliberate. Tom didn't dominate the room with volume or authority. He let the conversation move, stepping in only when it drifted too far from reality. Each time he spoke, it narrowed the focus, stripping away assumptions until only the structure remained. Ethan tried to keep pace. He responded confidently, projecting certainty even as the terrain shifted beneath him. When Tom questioned a revenue forecast tied to aggressive expansion, Ethan countered with optimism. When Tom asked about downside protections, Ethan pivoted to market momentum. It sounded convincing until Tom followed with specifics. "In 2008, Tom said evenly, momentum vanished in weeks. Companies that survived weren't the fastest. They were the ones with liquidity and patience." Ethan forced a smile. "This isn't 2008. "No," Tom agreed. "But human behavior hasn't changed." A murmur passed through the room. Not disagreement recognition. Ethan adjusted his tone, leaning into boldness. "We can't build strategy around fear," he said. "If we hesitate, competitors will move first." Tom nodded once. "Caution isn't fear," he replied. "It's discipline. There's a difference." He reached for a document Clara had quietly placed near him earlier, sliding it across the table. "This scenario assumes uninterrupted growth. What happens if credit tightens? What happens if supply chains contract? You haven't modeled that." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He hadn't. Across the table, Samantha watched the exchange with a growing sense of disorientation. She'd seen Ethan in meetings before, confident, persuasive, admired. She'd rarely seen anyone slow him down without raising their voice. Watching her father do it calmly, almost gently, unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. This was the man who taught her how to balance a checkbook, who'd insisted on understanding every contract before signing. Not outdated, grounded. In the back of the room, Clara remained seated, hands folded, eyes sharp. She said nothing, but she didn't need to. She watched as attention subtly shifted, as questions began to funnel toward Tom instead of Ethan. It wasn't a coup. It was gravity reasserting itself. Ethan felt it keenly. His foot tapped under the table. His answers came faster now, sharper, as if speed might compensate for depth. He made a claim about projected efficiencies, citing a recent trend. Tom didn't interrupt. He waited. Then he spoke. "That efficiency depends on external partners absorbing risk you're transferring," he said. "I've seen that fail. When pressure hits, those partners protect themselves first." Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, decisive. One by one, heads nodded. A few people scribbled notes. Someone asked Tom a follow-up question, then another. The conversation moved without Ethan's permission. Ethan's frustration surfaced despite his effort to contain it. His jaw tightened. His hands clenched, then stilled. He could feel control slipping, not because Tom was taking it, but because the room was giving it away. Tom didn't press the advantage. He didn't need to. His points stood on their own, supported by examples, by lived memory no slide deck could replicate. The respect in the room wasn't nostalgic anymore. It was present, active. Samantha felt something shift inside her chest, not guilt, clarity. She saw now how often she'd mistaken quiet for weakness, how easily she'd accepted Ethan's framing of modernity as superiority. Watching her father reclaim his place without anger or theatrics changed something fundamental in how she understood him. By the time the meeting drew toward a close, the outcome was undeniable. Tom hadn't overthrown Ethan. He'd eclipsed him, and everyone in the room knew it. As chairs scraped back and conversations resumed in hushed tones, Ethan remained seated for a moment, staring at the table. The realization settled heavily. He hadn't just underestimated Tom. He'd exposed himself. And as the room slowly emptied, Ethan understood that whatever move he made next would determine whether this reckoning ended in recovery or something far worse. The change in the room was no longer subtle. It moved like a current, pulling attention in a new direction without anyone announcing it. Where eyes had once tracked Ethan's gestures and slides, they now drifted toward Tom whenever a question surfaced. Chairs angled slightly in his direction. Pens paused, waiting. Tom didn't mistake it for loyalty. It was alignment professionals recognizing steadier ground when they felt it beneath their feet. Ethan sensed it too, and the awareness pushed him into overdrive. He leaned forward, voice sharpening as he launched into another pitch, layering ambition on top of ambition. Expansion timelines tightened. Revenue curves steepened. He spoke faster, as if momentum itself could reclaim the room. Tom listened, hands folded, expression unreadable. When Ethan finished, Tom didn't counter immediately. He let the silence breathe, long enough for the room to settle. Then he spoke, not louder, but slower. "That model assumes uninterrupted capital access," Tom said, "which works until it doesn't." Ethan scoffed lightly. "We've stress-tested against historical volatility." Tom cut in calmly. "Not structural shocks." He reached back into memory, not notes. In the late 90 seconds, we watched firms chase scale without redundancy. When the correction came, they collapsed not because demand disappeared, but because their systems had no tolerance for surprise. The room stilled. A few people exchanged glances. Ethan pressed on, more forcefully now. "This isn't the same market," Tom nodded. "Every generation believes that." A ripple of restrained reaction moved through the table, not laughter, not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. Ethan felt it like a bruise forming. Samantha watched, heart tightening. She'd hoped the meeting might settle things, that clarity would ease the tension between the two men. Instead, the divide was becoming unmistakable. She could see Ethan's pride bristling, his posture rigid, while her father remained grounded, almost gentle in his certainty. Then Tom did something no one expected. "I haven't shared this publicly," he said, glancing briefly around the table. Because timing matters more than novelty. He outlined a strategy he'd used decades earlier, one that prioritized controlled contraction before expansion, preserving leverage while competitors overextended. He explained how it created options instead of obligations, how it allowed decision-makers to wait while others rushed. The room leaned in. Someone asked a question. Then another. Ethan felt the shock ripple through him. This wasn't theory. It was lived strategy, adapted cleanly to modern conditions. No jargon, no performance, just structure. His defensiveness rose, sharp and reflexive. "That approach limits growth," he said, voice tight. "It preserves survival," Tom replied evenly. "Growth comes after." Ethan opened his mouth, then hesitated. For the first time, his certainty wavered. The arrogance that had once insulated him began to crack, revealing something raw beneath fear of being outmatched. Samantha caught his eye and felt a surge of urgency. During a brief break, she pulled him aside near the windows overlooking the city. "Please," she said quietly, "don't turn this into a fight." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, jaw clenched. "He's undermining me. He's answering questions you didn't," Samantha replied. "There's a difference. You're taking his side now?" "I'm asking you to breathe," she said, voice strained. "This isn't about ego. It's about the business." Ethan looked away, staring at the skyline. For a moment, his defenses softened. He exhaled slowly. "I didn't expect this," he admitted. Samantha nodded. "Neither did I." When they returned to the table, Ethan spoke less. He listened more, not because he wanted to, but because ignoring Tom was no longer an option. Every path forward now intersected with his father-in-law's insight. As the meeting drew toward its end, one truth settled heavily in Ethan's chest. The power in the room had shifted, and whether he adapted or resisted would decide how much of it he had left when the next move was made. The call came late in the evening, just as Tom was settling into the quiet of his study. The house had that familiar stillness, lamps low, clocks ticking softly, the day finally spent. When he saw the name on the screen, he didn't answer right away. He smiled first. "Franklin," he said when he picked up. "I was wondering how long it would take." The voice on the other end was warm, amused. "You always did know how to resurface at the right moment. Word's getting around that you're back in the room." Tom leaned back, listening as Franklin spoke about people asking questions, about old obligations quietly remembered. "You helped a lot of us when it counted," Franklin added. "That kind of thing doesn't disappear. It waits." Before Tom could respond, footsteps sounded behind him. Ethan had stopped in the doorway, drawn by the low murmur of conversation. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but he did. "I'm not asking for favors," Tom said into the phone. "Just conversations." "That's how it starts," Franklin replied. "I've got 2 investors you should speak to. They trust my judgment, and yours." Ethan's stomach tightened. Investors, conversations, trust. None of it included him. After the call ended, Ethan lingered, forcing a casual tone. "Sounded important." Tom met his gaze calmly. It was something about the simplicity of that answer unsettled Ethan more than defensiveness would have. He nodded once and walked away, the weight of what he'd overheard settling into something darker. He'd spent years building momentum, projecting certainty, yet here was Tom, making a single call and shifting gravity without trying. The next day, Samantha tried to intervene. She called for a private dinner, just the 3 of them, hoping distance from boardrooms and spreadsheets might soften the edges. Instead, the tension followed them to the table, unspoken but thick. "We need to talk," she said carefully. "Not as executives, as family." Ethan bristled immediately. Tom remained quiet, attentive. Samantha turned to her father. "I know you're stepping in more. I see why. But Ethan feels like he's losing ground." Tom nodded. "Because he is." Ethan pushed his chair back slightly. "You're doing this on purpose." "I'm doing what's necessary," Tom replied. "There's a difference." Samantha's voice trembled. "And where does that leave me?" Neither man answered. And in that silence, Samantha realized she was no longer mediating a misunderstanding. She was standing between 2 opposing visions of the future. That night, Tom began outlining a move he hadn't shared with anyone yet. A restructuring, carefully timed, that would reroute key financial decisions through channels he understood better than anyone else. It wouldn't erase Ethan's role, but it would redefine it. Across town, Ethan made his own move. He scheduled drinks with a few associates he believed were still firmly in his corner. He laughed louder than usual, spoke confidently, praised innovation. But when he hinted that Tom's involvement was temporary, the reaction wasn't what he expected. One of them hesitated. Another changed the subject. Finally, someone said it plainly. "Tom's been right before," the man said. More than once. The words hit harder than any insult. Over the next few days, Tom's calendar filled. Investor lunches, quiet meetings, familiar names returning calls with surprising eagerness. He didn't announce any of it. He didn't need to. The network spoke for itself. Ethan watched from the edges, frustration tightening into something closer to fear. Doors that once opened easily now required explanations. People listened, but they deferred. And as Tom moved steadily back into position, Ethan was left confronting a truth he could no longer avoid. Dismissing experience hadn't made him stronger. It had made him blind. And now, the cost of that blindness was becoming impossible to ignore. By midweek, the shift was undeniable. It didn't announce itself with headlines or formal votes. It moved quietly, almost politely, through calendars and conversations. Tom's name began appearing on meeting agendas, again not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. Stakeholders asked when he'd be available. Advisors deferred decisions until they'd run it by Tom. No one said Ethan was out, but fewer people acted as if he was fully in charge. Ethan felt it slipping and reacted the only way he knew how, by pushing harder. He spoke louder in meetings, sent longer emails, called impromptu briefings that felt more like performances than planning sessions. He made bold declarations about timelines and vision, framing decisiveness as leadership. But instead of rallying support, the urgency exposed cracks. People listened, nodded, and then quietly checked with Tom afterward. Samantha watched it unfold with growing unease. She moved between offices and calls, caught in fragments of conversations that stopped when she entered. At home, the tension was suffocating. Ethan paced more, slept less. Tom, by contrast, grew calmer, more deliberate, almost lighter. For the first time, Samantha began questioning her own place in all of it. She wasn't just a daughter or a wife anymore. She was part of a business drifting toward a reckoning, and she wasn't sure whether she was helping stabilize it or simply smoothing the path toward something inevitable. Behind the scenes, Tom worked steadily. He met with lenders who valued restraint, with investors who'd grown wary of spectacle, with partners who understood that longevity mattered more than speed. These weren't flashy meetings. No grand proposals, just quiet alignment around a venture that would require experience, credibility, and patience. Three things Tom possessed in abundance. The venture wasn't announced, but its outline took shape quickly. And critically, it required Tom's direct oversight, not symbolically, operationally. Ethan tried to insert himself once he sensed momentum building. He requested briefings, offered to streamline the process, suggested new angles that sounded impressive but lacked grounding. Each time, he encountered polite resistance. "Let's wait for Tom's input. Tom's already considered that. We're following Tom's framework for now." The words were never harsh, but they were final. Ethan's frustration edged into humiliation. He wasn't being challenged openly. He was being bypassed. Tom, meanwhile, made no effort to claim visible dominance. In meetings, he listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was measured, practical, difficult to argue with. He demonstrated without saying it that age hadn't dulled him. If anything, it had stripped away the need to prove anything. Wisdom, Samantha realized, wasn't slower. It was quieter. One evening, she finally confronted Ethan. Not angrily, not defensively, just honestly. "You're treating my father like he's in your way," she said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "He's not." Ethan scoffed weakly. "He's taking over. He's stabilizing," she replied. "There's a difference." He looked away. "You're on his side." "I'm on the side of not burning everything down because you're afraid to share control," she said, voice shaking despite herself. "You need to stop seeing him as competition." Silence followed. Long, heavy. Ethan didn't answer. And that, more than anything, unsettled her. Tom noticed the shift soon after, not just in meetings, but in Ethan's posture. The bravado softened. The interruptions slowed. It wasn't humility yet, but it was awareness. Tom adjusted accordingly, applying pressure without confrontation, narrowing options without issuing ultimatums. Every move Ethan made now required Tom's acknowledgement. Every shortcut closed into a corridor Tom understood better. The revolution wasn't loud. It was procedural. And as Tom reviewed the latest projections late one night, he understood something clearly. Ethan was running out of space. Not because Tom was attacking, but because the structure itself was bending toward experience. The question wasn't whether Ethan would notice. It was how he would react when he realized there was nowhere left to push. Ethan felt it most clearly in the smallest moments. Decisions he once made unchallenged now paused midair, waiting for Tom's input. Emails that used to land directly on his desk began including his father-in-law by default. Suggestions Ethan framed as directives returned, softened, revised, or quietly redirected. No one announced the change. They didn't have to. Control had shifted, and Ethan knew exactly when it had happened. He just didn't know how to reverse it. At home, the distance grew sharper. Samantha no longer defended him automatically. She listened more, questioned more. When Ethan vented about Tom's influence, she didn't rush to reassure him. Instead, she asked uncomfortable questions about risk, about tone, about whether he was leading or reacting. Ethan heard judgment where she intended concern, and resentment took root. The family dinner was meant to be neutral ground. Margaret had cooked, the table set carefully, conversation starting, safely, weather, schedules, small talk. Tom arrived calm, polite, unassuming. Ethan watched him closely, waiting for an opening. It came halfway through the meal. "I still don't understand why we're delaying the rollout," Ethan said, cutting through the conversation with forced casualness. "The market's moving fast. Hesitation costs opportunity." Tom dabbed his mouth with a napkin, unfazed. "So does overextension." Ethan leaned forward. "With respect, that approach limits growth." Tom met his gaze steadily. "With experience, I'd say it preserves optionality." The table went quiet. Samantha felt her chest tighten. She looked from Ethan to her father, instinctively bracing, but when Tom continued, his tone was measured, reasonable, impossible to dismiss. "Speed matters," Tom said. "But direction matters more. Right now, restraint keeps us flexible." Ethan scoffed lightly, hoping humor might pull others to his side. "Flexibility doesn't excite investors. It reassures them," Tom replied. Samantha spoke before she realized she was choosing. "It does," she said quietly, "especially now." Ethan turned to her, surprised, hurt. The look lingered just long enough to sting. After dinner, the tension followed them into separate corners of the house. Ethan retreated to his phone, firing off messages, arranging quiet conversations. He reached out to associates he believed still trusted him, framing Tom's influence as temporary, cautioning against old-world thinking. The responses came slower than he expected. Some were polite but vague. Others avoided commitment entirely. One long-time contact was blunt. "I don't know if you're seeing the whole picture," the man said. "Tom's instincts have saved more than one company I've worked with." Ethan hung up, jaw tight, the words echoing louder than any criticism. Meanwhile, Tom continued doing what he'd always done best, maintaining relationships. Not aggressively, not strategically, at least not on the surface. He checked in, asked questions, listened. His connection didn't need convincing. They trusted patterns, not promises. Samantha noticed it too. The difference between how Ethan pushed and how her father anchored. It unsettled her, forcing her to confront something she'd avoided for years. Ambition without humility was fragile, and Ethan was showing cracks. That night, the house fell quiet again. Ethan stared at the ceiling, replaying the dinner, the conversations, the looks. Tom sat in his study, reviewing notes, aware of the tension, but refusing to inflame it. Neither man spoke, but both understood the truth now. This wasn't about one meeting or one decision. It was a rivalry that had never been acknowledged aloud, and now it could no longer be ignored. As the lights went out and silence settled over the house, the distance between them felt less like space and more like a line waiting to be crossed. The investors arrived separately, quietly, each escorted into the private conference room without ceremony. Tom preferred it that way. No spectacle, no sense of urgency, just a table, a pot of coffee, and documents laid out with care. He spoke plainly, walking them through the structure he'd designed: measured growth, layered protections, contingencies built for uncertainty. The reaction was immediate. Questions came quickly. But they weren't skeptical. They were precise, curious. One investor leaned back midway through the discussion, nodding slowly. "This is refreshingly disciplined," she said. "We don't see enough of that anymore." Another followed. "You're not selling upside. You're selling durability." Tom smiled faintly. "Upside follows durability," he replied. By the end of the meeting, interest had solidified into intent. Not promises something better. Commitment. They didn't shake hands dramatically or announce anything. They simply asked for next steps, timelines, oversight, and each time, Tom's role was assumed, not negotiated. Across town, Ethan felt the doors closing. He attempted to reinsert himself into discussions that had once been his domain, only to find them already underway, structured, aligned, and no longer waiting for his approval. When he offered input, it was acknowledged politely and set aside. When he proposed alternatives, he was told they'd already been considered. Tom reviewed that, became the refrain. Frustration gave way to something sharper. Panic. He called David Martin late one evening, eager to regain footing. David answered, but his tone had changed, more distant, more careful. "I think we need to let this play out," David said when Ethan pressed. "There's value in stability right now." Ethan heard the subtext clearly. Tom was the stability. That night, Samantha sat with her mother at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. "I don't recognize either of them anymore," she admitted. "Every conversation feels like it's about leverage instead of family." Carla listened, eyes kind, but realistic. "Your father's been invisible for a long time," she said. "Now he's stepping back into himself." "And Ethan feels erased," Samantha replied. "They're both right, and both wrong." Carla reached across the table. "Then try again to mediate. Not to fix it, just to slow it down." Samantha nodded, though doubt clouded her face. She'd tried before. Each attempt had only highlighted how deep the divide had grown. Tom sensed it too. The progress was undeniable, momentum building, allies aligning, but it came at a cost. He noticed Samantha's distance, the careful way she spoke to him now, as if measuring each word. It stung more than Ethan's hostility ever had. This hadn't been his goal. He hadn't wanted to put her in the middle, but he also knew he couldn't step back now. Experience had taught him that authority, once reclaimed, had to be used responsibly, or it would be taken again. Meanwhile, David began quietly stepping away from Ethan's orbit. He declined meetings, redirected calls. When pressed, he offered vague explanations about long-term positioning. Ethan understood the message. Alignment had shifted, and it wasn't coming back easily. Late one night, Tom stood alone in his study, reviewing projections and notes. The realization settled slowly, heavily. He hadn't just regained influence. He'd secured permanence. The family business would move forward with or without Ethan's approval, and his voice would be part of it for as long as he chose. The thought brought no triumph, only resolve, because the more secure Tom's position became, the clearer it was that the next conflict wouldn't be about power. It would be about what it was costing the family to hold it. Ethan didn't plan the confrontation carefully. He reacted to it. The pressure had been building for days, missed calls, delayed approvals, conversations that happened without him. By the time he walked into Tom's study that evening, the frustration had hardened into resolve. Samantha followed a moment later, sensing what was coming but unable to stop it. "We need to talk," Ethan said, closing the door behind him. Tom looked up from his desk, calm, almost expectant. "Then, let's talk." Ethan didn't sit. He stood near the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You've been undermining me. Every decision I make gets questioned. Every relationship I build gets rerouted through you. You're making me look incapable." Tom didn't flinch. "I'm responding to gaps," he said evenly, "not creating them." "That's convenient," Ethan snapped. "You step in, suddenly everyone listens to you again, and I'm the problem." Samantha lowered herself into a chair, hands clasped, eyes moving between them. She said nothing. "Not yet." Tom folded his hands on the desk. "I'm not trying to push you out," he said. "I'm trying to make sure the business survives decisions driven by urgency instead of understanding." Ethan laughed sharply. "There it is. The lecture. You think because you've been around longer, you know better." "I know differently," Tom replied. "And that matters." Ethan stepped closer. "What you call experience, I call hesitation. The world doesn't wait anymore. Tom met his gaze without rising. The world still punishes arrogance. The words landed heavy. Samantha felt her chest tighten. This wasn't just about strategy anymore. It was about identity, about who each man believed he was allowed to be. I built momentum, Ethan said, voice rising. I took risks. I moved us forward. And you walked back in and turned all of that into doubt. I walked back in because momentum without structure collapses, Tom said calmly. I've seen it. More than once. Ethan turned to Samantha, frustration spilling over. You see this, right? He's dressing control up as concern. His methods are outdated. Slow. Defensive. Samantha hesitated, and in that hesitation, Ethan saw something shift. I see the flaws, she said carefully. In both of you. Ethan stared at her. So, you're on his side now? I'm on the side of reality, she replied. You dismiss questions instead of answering them. You call caution weakness. That's not leadership. Ethan shook his head, incredulous. You didn't grow up in boardrooms. You don't know what it takes. Tom spoke quietly. I know exactly what it takes. And I know what it costs when ego drives the process. Silence stretched between them, thick with resentment and recognition. Tom stood then, not abruptly, but with purpose. I'm not asking you to step aside, he said. I'm asking you to step up, prove your value through execution, through accountability, not through dominance. Ethan's fists clenched. And if I don't do it your way, then the business will still move forward, Tom replied. Because it has to. Samantha closed her eyes briefly. That was the line. She felt it as clearly as either of them. Ethan exhaled slowly, anger simmering beneath the surface. You think you've already won? Tom shook his head. This isn't about winning. It is to you, Ethan said bitterly. You get your respect back. I lose mine. No, Tom said. You lose the illusion that respect comes without substance. Ethan looked at Samantha one last time, searching for certainty, for alliance. What he found instead was doubt, quiet, honest, painful. The room fell silent again. Nothing was resolved. No apologies offered. No agreements reached. But as Ethan turned and walked out, one truth followed him down the hall, impossible to ignore. He was no longer fighting from a position of strength. And whatever he chose to do next would either redefine his place in the family business or erase it entirely. Ethan lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, staring at the ceiling as thoughts circled without landing. For the first time since he'd entered the family business, he couldn't see the next move clearly. The certainty he'd relied on, his sharpness, his drive, his belief that effort alone earned authority, had fractured. Meetings no longer bent his way. Conversations ended without his input. Control, once assumed, now felt conditional. He hated the feeling. By morning, the truth was unavoidable. His position was no longer guaranteed. He could keep fighting, doubling down on resistance, or he could do something far harder, adapt. But adaptation felt too much like surrender, and pride dug in deep. Samantha found him in the kitchen, coffee growing cold between them. She didn't start with accusations. She never did. This can't keep going, she said quietly. It's tearing everything apart. Ethan rubbed his face, exhaustion sharpening his irritability. So what? You want me to apologize for wanting to lead? I want you to listen, Samantha replied. My dad isn't trying to erase you. He's trying to stabilize something you're pushing too hard. He's pushing me out, Ethan said flatly. Samantha shook her head. He's challenging you. There's a difference. Ethan stood, pacing. I didn't marry into this family to be managed. And he didn't build his life's work to be dismissed, Samantha said. Her voice trembled despite her effort to stay calm. You're both fighting for the same thing. You just refuse to admit it. Ethan stopped pacing, jaw tight. I won't compromise who I am to fit his idea of leadership. Samantha looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something heavy settle in her chest. Then you're choosing conflict, she said softly. Across the house, Tom made his own decision. He'd watched long enough, listened enough, hoped quietly that Ethan would adjust. But hope wasn't strategy, and the business couldn't afford indecision masked as pride. If Ethan wouldn't find common ground, Tom would create stability without him. Not permanently, not yet, but clearly. He placed a call that afternoon, measured and deliberate, setting in motion a structural change that would formalize his role in upcoming decisions. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself, but it would make one thing unmistakable. The business would move forward under his guidance. Carla sensed the shift before anyone explained it. Years of watching Tom work had given her an instinct for momentum. That evening, she called Samantha and Ethan into the living room. "This has gone far enough," she said gently but firmly. "You're all talking past each other. It's time to sit down as a family and decide how this business and this family moves forward." Ethan frowned. "Another meeting won't fix this." "It might not," Carla agreed. "But avoiding it will make it worse." Samantha felt a familiar knot of dread. She knew what was coming, a conversation that would force choices no one was ready to make. Still, she nodded. "We need this," she said. "Even if it's uncomfortable." Ethan hesitated, then agreed, though the tension in his shoulders never eased. As plans for the meeting took shape, uncertainty hung in the air. Tom reviewed his notes, aware that the next discussion would be different. This wouldn't be about projections or strategy. It would be about roles, authority, trust, and possibly betrayal. Samantha sat alone later that night, staring at nothing, wondering how a family could love each other and still feel so divided. She knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened in that meeting would change everything. The stage was set, and when they finally sat down together, there would be no room left for avoidance, only decisions that could not be undone. Tom didn't hear it from a rival. He didn't hear it from the bank. He heard it from silence. An investor who had been responsive for weeks suddenly stopped returning calls. A meeting that had been tentatively scheduled was pushed back without explanation. Tom had lived long enough in business to know what that meant. Someone else was whispering in the same room. He didn't react right away. He verified. One quiet afternoon, he made 2 calls, asked 3 careful questions. By the time he set the phone down, the picture was clear enough to sting. Ethan had been negotiating privately with another investor. Not exploratory conversations, not casual feelers. A parallel deal structured to move forward without Tom's oversight, without his name anywhere near it. A deliberate attempt to bypass him entirely. Tom sat still for a long moment, anger rising slowly, settling deep. This wasn't competition. It was betrayal. Samantha learned the truth by accident. She'd been reviewing documents Ethan left open on his laptop, nothing invasive, just numbers that didn't align with what she'd heard discussed publicly. One unfamiliar name appeared repeatedly. Then an email thread. Then a calendar invite marked private. Her stomach dropped as the timeline came together. That night, she confronted Ethan in the kitchen, voice shaking despite her effort to stay calm. "Why didn't you tell me about this investor?" Ethan froze for half a second too long. "It wasn't finalized," he said quickly. "I didn't want to complicate things." "By cutting my father out?" she asked. His defensiveness flared. "This was about protecting the business." "No," Samantha said, tears burning behind her eyes. "It was about protecting your ego." The room fell silent, and in that silence, something between them cracked. Tom didn't raise his voice when he confronted Ethan the next morning. He didn't need to. "You went around me," Tom said plainly. "Not because it was good for the business, but because you wanted control without accountability." Ethan straightened. "I was creating options. You were hiding decisions," Tom replied. "There's a difference." Ethan tried to justify it, talked about urgency, about feeling boxed in, about not wanting to ask permission. The words came fast, rehearsed, but Tom heard what wasn't being said. "You didn't trust me," Tom said quietly. "And worse, you didn't respect the process." Ethan scoffed. "You think you're the only one who knows how to make deals?" "No," Tom said. "I think you're the only one who thinks he knows better than everyone else." That landed. Samantha stood frozen in the doorway, listening. Every defense she'd offered Ethan over the years unraveled in real time. The dismissals, the secrecy, the way ambition had slowly crowded out humility. She saw it now not as confidence, but as fear disguised as dominance. "I covered for you," she said, her voice breaking as she stepped forward. "I told myself you meant well, that my dad was being difficult." Ethan turned to her, stunned. "Sam." "No," she interrupted. "You crossed a line." The realization hurt more than she expected. Not just that Ethan had betrayed her father, but that she'd helped make it possible by excusing behavior she knew, deep down, was wrong. Tom watched his daughter quietly, grief and resolve colliding in his chest. He hadn't wanted this moment, but he wouldn't soften the truth to spare Ethan's pride. "You don't build a future by erasing the past," Tom said. "And you don't lead by cutting people out." Ethan's arguments faltered. For the first time, there was nowhere left to pivot. No narrative that held. The dynamic had shifted completely. Samantha looked at the two men. One who had earned authority through decades of restraint, and one who had chased it through force. The choice she'd avoided for so long stood directly in front of her now, and as the weight of it settled in her chest, one thing became painfully clear. Whatever she chose next wouldn't just define the business. It would redefine her marriage and her family forever. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, quiet and heavy, settling into every corner of the house. Ethan tried to act as if things could still be repaired with the right words. He followed Samantha from room to room, offering explanations that sounded more like revisions of the truth than remorse. He spoke about pressure, about fear of losing relevance, about how everything he'd done was meant to secure their future. But Samantha listened differently now. Each sentence was weighed. Ich omission noticed. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally, standing at the edge of their bedroom, arms folded tightly around herself. "And that scares me more than anything else." The words cut deeper than anger ever had. Ethan reached for her, then stopped, his hand hovering uselessly in the space between them. "I'm still me," he said quietly. "I just made mistakes." Samantha shook her head. "You made choices." While Ethan struggled to hold on to what he was losing, Tom moved with clarity. He didn't relish the moment, but he didn't avoid it either. The business needed stability, and indecision would only invite further fracture. Tom accepted the role that had already been forming around him, not as a victor, but as a necessity. Calls were made, oversight was formalized. Decision-making authority shifted, now unmistakably centered with him. No announcement followed. There didn't need to be one. The board took notice quickly. Ethan's recent decisions were reviewed with a level of scrutiny he'd never experienced before. Deals he'd rushed were questioned. Projections he'd defended aggressively were re-examined. The confidence that once shielded him now only drew sharper attention. One evening, the family finally sat together. Samantha broke first. Tears streamed freely as she looked between the two men who had shaped her life in different ways. "I don't understand how it got this bad," she said, voice breaking. "Every year, every argument, I kept telling myself it would pass." Tom's expression softened. He stood slowly, as if the weight of the moment required it. "I should have been more present," he said. "Not just as a businessman, but as your father. I thought providing stability was enough. I see now that silence felt like absence." Samantha cried harder at that, not because the words hurt, but because they rang true. Tom continued, voice steady but heavy. "Everything I did was to protect this family. That doesn't excuse the distance it created. I own that." Ethan watched, his defenses eroding. "So I'm just the villain now?" he asked bitterly. "No," Samantha said through tears. "But you're not the victim either." Ethan tried to explain himself again, softer this time, less certain. He spoke about proving his worth, about living in Tom's shadow, about fear masquerading as ambition. The honesty came late, but not entirely without meaning. Still, it wasn't enough. The damage had moved beyond feelings. Stakeholders were watching, trust had thinned, and no amount of justification could rewind the consequences already set in motion. From the corner of the room, Carla observed quietly. She didn't intervene. She didn't need to. Years of partnership had taught her when power had truly shifted, and this time it was permanent. Tom wasn't asserting dominance. He was being relied upon. Samantha wiped her face, breathing unevenly. "I see it now," she said softly. "Dad, what you built didn't disappear. I just stopped looking." Tom met her eyes, something close to relief passing through him. She turned to Ethan, her expression aching but resolute. "And you have to face what you've done. Not just to the business, but to us." Ethan lowered his gaze. For the first time, there was no argument waiting behind his silence. As the room emptied, the air remained heavy with unresolved grief and new understanding. Tom stood alone for a moment, aware that authority had come at a cost he never wanted but one he would bear. Behind him, Ethan lingered, staring at the floor, realizing that arrogance had finally exacted its price. And Samantha, standing between past and future, understood that reconciliation, if it came at all, would demand more than words from either of them. The apology came without warning. Ethan stood in the doorway of Tom's study one morning, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight as if bracing for impact. Tom looked up from his desk, surprised but composed. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said. The words sounded practiced, but the strain behind them was real. "I crossed lines. I made decisions I shouldn't have. I let pride steer things." Tom listened without interrupting. "I don't know if I fully understood what I was risking," Ethan added after a pause. "But I know I was wrong. It wasn't a complete reckoning. There were no tears, no sudden humility. But it was something, and Tom recognized it for what it was. The first crack in armor that had never been designed to bend. "I hear you," Tom said finally. "Understanding comes later. Accountability comes first." Ethan nodded, jaw clenched, accepting the boundary even if he didn't yet know how to live within it. Samantha, watching from the hall, felt a cautious release of breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Later that evening, she brought them together, not in a boardroom, not in a study, but at the kitchen table where arguments had once ended in silence. "I can't keep doing this," she said, voice steady but tired. "Being the space between you. I need peace, and the business needs stability." She looked at her father. "Can you try to work with him?" Then, at her husband. "Can you stop trying to win?" Tom considered her words carefully. "I'll work with him," he said. "But trust isn't restored by intention. It's rebuilt by consistency." Ethan swallowed hard. "I understand." He didn't. Not fully. But he was beginning to. The days that followed were quieter. Meetings became less volatile. Decisions moved through clearer channels. Tom assumed a more visible leadership role, not to overshadow, but to anchor. He slowed the pace where it mattered, delegated where appropriate, and created space for scrutiny without spectacle. Ethan worked harder than he ever had before, not to dominate, but to prove reliability. He double-checked numbers. He asked questions he'd once dismissed. Still, tension lingered. Every misstep felt magnified. Every success felt provisional. Tom noticed and adjusted his own approach. He remembered Samantha's tears, Carla's silence. He understood now that authority without care hollowed out what it protected. So he led differently, firm but attentive, decisive but human. One evening, Samantha and Ethan sat together on the edge of their bed, the weight of the past months pressing between them. "We can't pretend this didn't change us," Samantha said softly. Ethan nodded. "I don't want to be that person anymore." They agreed to therapy not as a gesture, but as a commitment, to confront the insecurities that had driven Ethan's need for control, to address the resentment Samantha had buried under loyalty. It wasn't a cure. It was a beginning. At work, stability returned gradually. Investors relaxed, partners re-engaged. The chaos receded into structure. Tom's reputation, never truly gone, settled back into place with quiet authority. And within the family, something shifted too. Respect, once fractured, began to reassemble not because it was demanded, but because it was demonstrated. Tom didn't celebrate the change. He didn't trust it fully yet. But as he reviewed reports late one night, he allowed himself a measured thought. The business was moving forward. The family was still standing. And while the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. This turning point had reshaped all of them in ways none of them could undo. The conversation happened without witnesses. No boardroom, no agenda. Just Tom and Ethan sitting across from each other in the quiet of the study, late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the shelves. The tension that once filled the room was still there, but thinner now, worn down by exhaustion and consequence. "We can't keep circling each other," Ethan said finally. His voice was steadier than before, but not confident, honest. "Not if this family is going to survive what we've put it through." Tom studied him for a long moment. He saw less defiance now, more awareness. "Working together isn't about agreement," he said. "It's about responsibility." Ethan nodded. "I understand that now. Or, I'm starting to." There was a pause. Then Ethan exhaled slowly. "I was wrong," he said. "About you. About what experience actually means. I thought ambition was enough. I didn't see how blind it made me." The words landed differently than previous apologies. They weren't rushed. They weren't defensive. "I want to learn," Ethan added quietly. "If you're willing." Tom felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly, but recognition. "Learning requires patience," he said, "and humility." "I know," Ethan replied. "I don't expect trust overnight." Tom leaned back, weighing the moment. Then he nodded once. "I won't give you shortcuts," he said, "but I'll show you how to build something that lasts." That was the agreement. Simple, unspoken, but firm. From the doorway, Samantha watched them, tears gathering without warning. She didn't step in. She didn't need to. For the first time in years, she wasn't bracing for impact. She was witnessing alignment. In the weeks that followed, the change was gradual but real. Ethan asked more questions than he answered. He slowed down. He listened. Decisions once fueled by urgency now passed through deliberation. Under Tom's guidance, innovation found structure instead of resistance. The balance didn't dull Ethan's edge, it refined it. Tom, for his part, taught without condescension. He shared not just strategies, but mistakes, deals that failed, risks that nearly cost him everything, lessons earned the hard way. Mentorship, he realized, wasn't about authority, it was about transparency. The family felt the shift too. Dinners grew easier, conversations less guarded. Laughter returned in small, cautious bursts. Trust didn't snap back into place. It stitched itself slowly, reinforced by consistency rather than promises. The business responded in kind. Stability attracted confidence. Confidence attracted growth. Under Tom's steady leadership and Ethan's recalibrated ambition, the company began to flourish, not loudly, but sustainably. One evening, after a long day, Tom and Samantha sat together on the back porch, the city lights distant and soft. "I didn't think we'd get here," Samantha admitted. Tom smiled faintly. "Neither did I." She leaned her head against his shoulder, something she hadn't done in years. "Thank you," she said, "for staying, for fighting when it mattered." Tom rested his hand over hers. "Family is worth fighting for," he said, "even when it's messy." They sat in silence after that, comfortable, reflective. The road ahead was still uncertain. Trust would need guarding. Growth would demand restraint. But, for the first time in a long while, they weren't facing it divided. And as the house behind them filled with quiet movement, Ethan's voice drifting faintly from another room, Tom allowed himself to believe that reconciliation wasn't the end of the story. It was the foundation for whatever came next. The change didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded steadily, almost quietly, like a system correcting itself after a long period of strain. The business began to grow again, not recklessly, not fueled by bravado, but with intention. Decisions were debated openly, pressure tested, refined. Tom and Ethan worked together with an ease that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Where there had once been tension, there was now rhythm. Where there had been competition, there was complement. Samantha felt it first at home. Mornings were calmer. Conversations no longer circled around unresolved arguments or defensive explanations. She caught herself breathing easier, realizing how much of her energy had been spent bracing for conflict. Peace, she learned, wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, consistent, earned. For the first time in years, she wasn't choosing sides. She was watching them stand on the same one. As stability took hold, Tom began to step back from daily operations, not out of fatigue, but out of trust. He still reviewed critical decisions, still asked the uncomfortable questions, but he no longer needed to be everywhere. Ethan had earned space, and Tom was willing to give it. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. Responsibility felt different when it wasn't forced or contested. He took on more leadership, not as a performance, but as a practice. He built relationships on his own terms now, without posturing, without comparison. When he spoke about strategy, he acknowledged history instead of dismissing it. When he disagreed with Tom, it was with preparation, not defiance. And Tom listened. That, more than anything, marked the difference. The family marked the moment simply. A dinner, no speeches, no declarations, just gratitude shared between courses and laughter that came easier than expected. Carla watched them all with quiet satisfaction. Knowing how close they'd come to losing more than a business, Tom felt pride, not the sharp kind he'd once chased, but something deeper. He saw in Ethan a man finally grounded by experience instead of threatened by it. He saw in Samantha a steadiness that had been hard-won, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was guarding a legacy alone. Later that evening, Tom stood by the window, watching the city lights blink on, one by one. Ethan joined him, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed. "I didn't say it enough before," Ethan said, "but I get it now. What you built, what it costs." Tom nodded. Understanding always comes after consequences. Ethan smiled faintly. "I wish I'd learned that sooner." "So do I," Tom replied. "But learning late is still learning." They stood side by side, not speaking, not competing, just present. Tom felt something settle inside him, a renewed sense of purpose that had nothing to do with control. Mentorship, he realized, wasn't about holding on. It was about knowing when to let go and when to stay close enough to guide. The future was still uncertain. Markets would shift, mistakes would be made, trust would need tending. But the foundation felt solid now, reinforced by humility instead of ego. As they turned back toward the room where Samantha and Carla were talking softly, Tom caught Ethan's eye. There was no challenge there anymore, no unspoken rivalry, only alignment. And as they walked forward together, Tom understood that this wasn't the end of his story in the business or in the family. It was the beginning of something steadier, built not on dominance, but on mutual respect and the quiet strength of working side by side. Tom stood alone in the office early that morning, the building quiet in a way it rarely was anymore. Sunlight filtered through the windows, catching dust in the air, illuminating shelves lined with binders and framed photographs, fragments of a life spent building, losing, and rebuilding again. He hadn't planned to reflect, but stillness had a way of inviting it. There was a time when he'd believed relevance was something you aged out of, that the world moved forward and left men like him behind, clinging to habits no one wanted anymore. He'd been wrong. Experience didn't vanish. It waited. It matured. And when the moment demanded it, it spoke louder than trend or speed ever could. Ethan's footsteps echoed down the hall, pulling Tom from his thoughts. He entered with a familiarity that felt earned, not assumed. "I've been thinking about something," Ethan said, leaning against the desk. "I don't think I ever thanked you properly." Tom raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For not walking away," Ethan replied. "For calling me out when it mattered. For teaching me that leadership isn't about being the loudest person in the room." Tom considered that, then nodded. "You did the harder part," he said. "You listened." Ethan smiled, the tension that once defined him replaced by something steadier. "I'm still learning." "So am I," Tom replied. Downstairs, Samantha watched them through the glass wall, a quiet smile settling on her face. The men she loved were no longer circling each other, no longer braced for impact. They were aligned, and in that alignment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: certainty. Family dinners had become easy again. Laughter no longer felt like a temporary ceasefire. Carla moved through the house with calm assurance, seeing her family finally occupy the same space without friction. The business continued to thrive, guided by balance rather than dominance. Each person knew their role. Each voice mattered. Growth came with restraint, innovation with accountability. For Tom, the greatest shift wasn't professional, it was internal. He no longer felt caught between the man he had been and the one he was becoming. The past didn't haunt him, it informed him, and the future no longer felt like something he had to fight to be part of. One evening, as the day wound down, Tom and Ethan walked out of the office together, the city glowing softly around them. "Hard to believe how close we came to tearing everything apart," Ethan said. Tom nodded. "Sometimes things have to break before they realign." They walked in comfortable silence, neither leading, neither following. Tom felt gratitude not for victory, but for resolution, for the chance to pass on what mattered without bitterness, for the knowledge that legacy wasn't control or even success. It was continuity. As they reached the end of the block, Samantha's car pulled up, headlights flashing briefly. She watched them approach father and husband, side by side, and understood something fundamental. Strength wasn't domination. It was unity. And as Tom and Ethan walked forward together, Their shadows stretching long across the pavement, they embodied what the journey had taught them both, that wisdom earned, forgiveness given, and respect shared could carry not just a business but a family into a future built to last.